Hi, this is Scott Israel with First Vision, and today we're going to talk about untangling the megapixel lens myth, which is the best lens to buy and how to make that decision. Before I get into the presentation, I also want to thank Greg Hollows from Edmund Optics and Stu Singer from Schneider Optics for some of the material in here. While I consider myself very knowledgeable about optics, these two guys really are experts in our industry. The reason I decided to make this presentation is we get calls all the time asking to purchase specific lenses. First Vision is an independent distributor. We sell about 10 different brands of lenses. We probably have over 1,000 lenses in stock. And as I say later, we don't have a dog in the fight. We can just as easily sell you brand A versus brand B. So if you want lens XYZ, we can give it to you. However, when I ask about the application, in about 50% of the cases, the lens being asked for can be replaced by a better lens for less money, or it might not do the job because a better performance lens is needed. I hope that at the end of the presentation, you will at least know what questions to ask and hopefully help yourself get the correct answer to these questions. In this presentation, we're going to go over lens basics, explain figures of merits of lenses, show how to measure performance of lenses, tell what to look for once it's measured, explain how not to get fooled by the numbers, and ultimately choose the best price performance lens for your application and budget. So let's start with some basics. What does a lens do? Basically, it transfers an image from one place to another. It also magnifies or demagnifies an image. For example, you have a 10 millimeter sensor that's usually on a diagonal, but it could be on the sides for this example, and you have a 1000 millimeter image. In this case, you want to demagnify or reduce by a factor of 100. Now let's say you have the same 10 millimeter sensor and a 1 millimeter object. In this case, you want to magnify by a factor of 10. Standard lenses, those are the typical factory automation lenses that you see at the end of cameras, work well demagnifying from infinity to about 3x. Microscopes typically are needed when magnifying by greater than a factor of 5x. So we need to know how to calculate the magnification and the focal length of a lens. To start with, you have to know a few things to choose a lens. You must know what size sensor you're going to use. You must have an idea about the size of the object you're imaging, which is also called the field of view, or FOV. And you must have an idea about how far away the lens is from the object being viewed. Lenses typically come sized by focal length. There's a 6 millimeter, an 8 millimeter, a 12 millimeter, 16, 25, 35, 50, 75, and 100 millimeters are the common focal lengths used. There are smaller ones than 6. They're usually 4, 5, 3.5s, 2.8s, etc. Now the magnification of the system is what we saw in the last slide. It's the size of the imager divided by the field of view that you're trying to look at. The focal length, for its formula to figure out what you're going to need, is the distance from the object to the imager divided by 1 over the magnification. If you know any of these three variables, you can then calculate the fourth. So for instance, if you know the focal length and you want to figure out how far away you should be for a certain size picture and a certain size imager, you can get that as well. So now we know how to calculate the focal length. But what makes lenses different? There are lots of lenses with the same focal length. How do we know which is better, which is worse? What are we going to do to figure this out? Lenses are rated by their resolving power, which we'll see later on is given in line pairs per millimeter, also LP/mm. Once you know the line pair per millimeter, this can be plotted versus contrast to give the modulation transfer function. Other measurements and figure of merits you might see would include distortion and aberration. So how do we define resolution? if we look at the two pictures left and right, we can see that in figure A on the left, the two squares are imaged onto neighboring pixels, but they're indistinguishable from each other. Without any space between, instead of seeing two pixels here, you see one large rectangle in the image. In order to distinguish them, a certain amount of white space is needed, as in figure B. Here you can see that the line pair is discernible on the sensor. Now, how does the contrast depend on the frequency? And the frequency here we're talking about is the spatial frequency. So in the picture on the right, in the top, you can see clearly there's two red dots, and they're represented by two nicely defined square waves. When we put it through the system, which is the lens, we're not going to get those two nice square waves. We're going to get a little bit of blur here. And those two nice square waves become the two waves that you're seeing here on the right. And you get to see the corresponding image blur. As those two dots get closer and closer together, the nice square wave that you see here gets modified a bit, and when they overlap, instead of getting two separate spots, we get one spot that's not being able to distinguish the two here. And you can also see that the contrast is going to change. We can plot this information in the form of the modulation transfer function. So let's look again at the spatial frequency versus contrast. On the top, we have a test pattern where the line pairs are getting closer and closer. So this is a frequency modulation. We're putting it through the lens, and below you can see that this image, we don't have the same contrast anymore. As the line pairs get closer and closer, we have less contrast. So the brightness distribution represented right below here shows a nice 0 to 1 modulation. Then we're getting maybe 30% and then maybe 10%. And here is what we can plot. This is the modulation transfer function. On the bottom, line pairs per millimeter. On the left axis, we're looking at the contrast, the modulation.